In the summer of 1943, the war situation in the Mediterranean had not necessarily developed in favor of the Axis powers, and especially Italy. Following Operation Torch and the conclusion of the successful campaigns in North Africa, Operation Husky, the Allied capture of Sicily, the Allies were poised to invade the Italian mainland. The war had turned into a war of attrition and exhaustion for Italy and the Regia Marina, costing the nation a significant portion of the fleet, its African colonies, most of its merchant marine, and now Sicily. By August 1943, Benito Mussolini had been deposed and replaced by Pietro Bollio, a former army chief of staff. Almost at once, he began negotiations with the Allies for an armistice. Bollio made several changes in the armed forces, and, importantly, Admiral Udo Riccardi, who had been in charge of the Regia Marina, was replaced by Admiral Rafael de Corten, who, not made aware of the negotiations, along with his admirals like Carlo Bergamini, when on the 8th of September he was called upon to lead a fleet of Italian battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, including his new flagship, the 46,000-ton Battleship Roma, to Allied-controlled ports, with the Germans on their way to take control of the ships. Bergamini first took his ships to La Milena, off Sardinia. Then, after made aware the Germans occupied the city, they were to steam to the North African coast and meet the British there. However, the Roma would never make it, as that afternoon, German bombers arrived overhead, and through the use of the new FX-400 guided bombs sunk Bergamini. Flagship Roma went down quickly, taking over 1,000 of her sailors with. Background her, for the sake of time, and me attempting to explain the complexities of the backroom negotiations between the Allies and Italian representatives, we'll move to the night of September the 8th, when at 7:45 p.m., Bollio announced the armistice with the Allies. Dorton, who had recently learned about the armistice, and once coming to terms with the armistice, passed the news to Bergamin with the conditions and the orders to execute them. Bergamini renewed his protest at having everything kept from him, as he had learned from the Allied broadcast made by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Before Bollio made his announcement and said that he was leaning towards scuttling his ships, the two discussed the possibility of moving his ships to La Milena to remove the squadron from the German threat. But before leaving, Bergamini called a new meeting of his admirals and commanders to explain them. Moral sacrifice they were called to make. The meeting began at about 10 p.m. aboard the Vorio Veto, the only major warship still linked by telephone to Rome, as the others were moored in the roadstead. Bergamini explained the situation to the officers under his command, and the importance of the Navy to the nation. After further conversations with his officers, another conversation with de Corten followed at 11:00 p.m., which again was also very heated. The admirals were very nervous to move the ships from Laspia, which was threatened by German troops. Finally, Dorten convinced Bergamini to weigh anchor immediately for La Milena, using as leverage the fact that King Victor Emmanuel III would also be there, which was, in fact, not true, as the planned transfer of the king to Sardinia had overtaken events, as German parachute units were close to occupying critical positions on the island. This was really an expedient to win Bergamini over. In World War II, at sea, a global history. Crail Simmons, he writes about Bergamini's speech to his men at Laspia. Admiral Carlo Bergamini, who had succeeded Occhino in command of the squadron, called his officers together to convince them otherwise. "This is not what we imagined," he told them, "but this is the course by which we must now steer, because what counts in the history of a people is not dreams and hopes, but the consciousness of duty carried out to the bitter end." Dorten was resigned to sending the ships to Malta. Still, he was highly apprehensive about their ultimate fate, because he had not received any assurances about their possession. So this layover at La Milena would serve to buy time to clarify this extremely delicate point. Bergamini consented to leave Laspia and Genoa with all available ships, including those under repair, but capable of movement. Supermarina transmitted the order to Bergamini at 11:45 and called for the naval battle. forces to move to La Molina for a brief stay to take from Armino Bonesco and Osto de Toro. In their book, The Lorio Class, Italy's Last and Largest Battleships, 1937 to 1948. There, Bergamini was to receive written instructions from Admiral Bruno Bravesi, which it is now known included the order to proceed to Bonn in the dispositions of the Dick Memorandum. It is not clear if Bergamini had already had an inkling of these dispositions at 1:38 a.m. on September 9th. The Commander-in-Chief of the Naval Battle Forces issued the departure order to all subordinate and attached ships as follows. From Laspia 9th Division, Roma Flagship of Commander-in-Chief, Naval Battle Forces Italia. Vittorio Veneto cruisers, destroyers, and other torpedo boats came from Laspia, along with other ships from Genoa, including some light cruisers and torpedo boats. Roma, with Bergamini on board Italia, and then Vittorio Veneto left Laspia in that order, preceded by the 7th Division Attila Regalo and the destroyers at 3:40 a.m. on the 9th. All ships had passed through the Laspia barriers and set course to the southwest. The Genoa group weighed anchor at 2:47 a.m. and set a southerly course. Shortly after 6 a.m., north of Cap Rosso, the two groups joined into a single formation, with the light cruisers and torpedo boats falling in line with the others. Navigation of the group proceeded was zigzagging to the southwest and then to the south along the west coast of Corsica at a speed no greater than 22 knots, rather than the 24 knots that had been called for due to the Italia's outboard engine condensers by 9 a.m. Additional torpedo boat escorts joined and assumed a scouting position over the horizon, ahead of the formation taking from Bonesco and Dioro again at 9:01 on the 9th. Supermarina transmitted the order to execute Commando Supremo's Memorandum No. 1, which called for resistance against the Germans. But during the night, Bergamini had already given orders to be on the highest alert against any possible attacks by the Luftwaffe. From 11:50 on the 9th, Supermarina began issuing a clear proclamation of encouragement by Decker to all Italian naval personnel during this time of extraordinary difficulty at about 12:30 on the 9th. However, small German units that were already in the waters around La Molina easily took over the base, using motorized barges and other small craft ahead of the planned transfer of VOC units from Sardinia to Corsica. As soon as Supermarina learned of this news, it sent a message to Bergamini and was received aboard Roma at 2:24 p.m., informing him of the occupation of La Maddalena and ordered him to change course and head to Cape Bon. Bergamini and his ships had entered the Gulf of Asinata at about 12:15, with ships in line-ahead formation, with the torpedo boats and destroyers, and close escort following the swept channels through the minefields. Orders were given at 2:39 for the first of the torpedo boat groups, and then all the battle forces at 2:41 to change course, and a simultaneous turn to port occurred. When this was complete, Roma found herself in the trailing position of the 9th Division at 3:40. Supermarina clarified their orders about sailing to Bonn and provided signals for when they encountered Allied ships. This last message was either not deciphered or did not reach Roma before she was fatally hit late in the afternoon, while the Italian fleet was steaming northwest, leaving the Gulf of Asinata. An attack began by 28 Dorer D-217 twin-engine bombers of the 2nd and 3rd groups of the 100th Bomb Wing of the 3rd LOF Flat based in Provence. According to the plan for the neutralization of the Italian armed forces in case of their defection, the German aircraft attacked from an altitude of more than 6,000 meters, or about 20,000 feet, using the PC-400X. Armor-piercing guided bombs designed as anti-ship weapons. Bonesco and Doro described the bombs as, this was a weapon that retained the basic shape of a conventional bomb, but had 4 movable tail fins array in an X pattern that were able to modify the bomb's trajectory within certain limits. Directional control of the fins was by radio control from the aircraft that had dropped the bomb. The bomb had no supplementary propulsion system, But there was a luminous flare on the rear of the bomb that enabled the bomb aimer aboard the plane to follow its trajectory. The weapon, also known as the Fritz X, weighed 1,570 kilograms, of which 320 kilograms was the explosive charge, and was easily able to pierce armor plate thicker than 130 millimeters from a height of 6,000 meters. The bomb had recently been issued to air units. It had previously been used in the Mediterranean theater and would go on to damage and/or sink other vessels, including the British battleship HMS Warspite, the cruisers USS Savannah, and HMS Uganda. Two of these Fritz X bombs hit, sinking Roma at 346 and at 352. The first the area of the starboard engine room, the second and midships towards the port side near the bridge tower. The explosion of the second bomb detonated the forward magazine containing the 15-inch propellant charges, and the ship broke into and sank. A witness from the cruiser Attila Regalo remembers the scene vividly. Terrible yellow-red flame bursts out and envelops all the bow of the part of the beautiful ship, while a gigantic pillar of smoke climbs up to several hundred meters into the air, and thousands of pieces of iron blown up now continue to fall into the sea. In the Special Inquest Commission, they say 1,253 men, including Admiral Bergamini and his entire staff, died. Other sources claimed numbers closer to 1,400 men died. Other ships were hit, including Italia at 429 towards their bow, causing light damage and flooding. The attacks would continue until 550, but no further successful strikes occurred. Light cruiser Attila Regalo, destroyers and torpedo boats were sent to rescue survivors of Roma. The individual squadron commanders independently decided to head for the Bolix and meet there the following day. They rowed off of North Africa, where a British squadron escorted them into Bizerta. The operation's name was a nod to this. Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the code name for the British Operation 4. The reception and escort of the surrendered Italian fleet was Operation Gibbon. The damage to the Roma was quite extensive, as shown through our going down so quickly, and because of that, the damage I discussed comes from the sources in the description and is somewhat speculation. Simmons writes the brand new Roma, which had never been in battle or even fired her guns in anger, sank quickly. Bergamini, who had carried out his duty to the bitter end, as promised, was one of the more than 1,300 killed. But the first bomb at 346 hit the ship 1M from the bottom, starboard deck between the 90mm gun mounts 9 and 11, passing through the hull, penetrating 3 armor decks, and probably exploded under the hull in the areas of boilers 7 and 8. Between that compartment and the after engine room, the damage would have been the destruction and flooding of boiler rooms 5, 6, 7, and 8 of the starboard aft engine rooms. In the adjacent compartments, collapse of the rangefinder antenna on the starboard 15-2. Okay, no more. Thank you so much. The audio wants to hear more about what happened here. It's been fun, and I hope you're going to enjoy the next part as much as we do, so wish me now and a great time. Well done, and God bless. Night fire, director station, flooding of the internal bulges, voids, balancing cells in the area of the explosion, damage of varying extent to the starboard 90mm battery, damage to the port 90mm mounts, fire towards the ship's stern, and as a result of this attack, electrical power and lights were cut in the F section, but were quickly restored, thanks to the engineers. The second bomb at 352 hit the center of the ship between the bridge tower and the second main battery turret, and the number 1 secondary battery turret forward on the port side. Bomb penetrated the 3 armored decks, again, most likely exploded in the forward port engine room. Now, there was an interval of about 10 seconds that passed between the bomb's explosion and the explosion of the charges in number 1 turret's magazine, and the imposing escape of steam prior to the large smoke cloud following the detonation of the charges in the adjacent main magazine. This LIFO bomb caused the following damage. As Bonesco and Dioro describe destruction and flooding of the forward port engine rooms, deflagration of the propellant charges in the forward port main gun magazine, deflagration of the propellant charges in the magazine of number 2 main turret, and hurling the turret weighing almost 1,600 tons into the sea, probable deflagration of the propellant charges in the magazine of number 1 main turret, leaning of the tower, structure forward and starboard, flooding of the previously cited magazines, huge fires in the forward portion of the ship, cutting of electrical power throughout the ship, reduction of the metacentric height as a result of the widespread flooding. To take from Beanies and Dioro, again, the ship's ability to float and her stability had already been compromised by the first bomb. In the few minutes before the fatal blow, the port list had been contained by automatic balancing to starboard and transfer of water to several of the portside cells. By the time the second bomb hit, the list had been reduced to 2 degrees. But the ship's stability was already critical because of the numerous spaces that were open to the sea, or that were otherwise flooded. The explosion of the forward magazines compromised the situation. It was possible as long as the explosion was not vented upward, but instead exerted a downward pressure, that it might keep the flooding in check in the affected spaces. Still, after venting upward, it accelerated the flooding due to the suction effect. The ship began to heel over to starboard, temporarily steadying following the forward flooding at a list of 10 to 12 degrees and with a fall deck edge 50 from the water. It was in these few minutes that most of the survivors, almost all of them from the stern sections, were able to save themselves by jumping into the water. The ship soon resumed her starboard heel. The deck edge disappeared under the surface, and the ship turned over on her starboard side. As the water flowed into the other spaces through the breach made by the first bomb, and through the open barbette of number 2 turret on the focal, and the shifting of large volumes of liquids in the hull, as soon as she turned over, Roma broke into 2 at the point where she had been hit by the second bomb, which had put tremendous stress on the structure, as had the explosions of the propellant magazines and the flooding. Once the ship had turned over, the effect of the flooding was reversed. The upper decks, which were built to withstand the compression forces, were now subjected to totally opposite stress forces and gave way. All the other longitudinal members, which had already been under great stress, also gave way. As a result, Roma disappeared beneath the conclusion surface at 4:15 p.m. with an extremely high loss of life. As I mentioned earlier, officially there were 1,253 dead, including Vice Admiral K. Bergamini and his entire staff. There were no survivors from the areas forward of the tower, except for one signalman. There were 596 survivors, almost all of whom were from the AF sections. Losses could have been significantly higher. The ship in her structure had not withstood the blast and the flooding for almost 20 minutes, allowing enough time to save them. One last thing. From Badges and Dioro, penetration of all the armored decks by both bombs does not reflect any particular weakness of the horizontal protection, even considering the mistake of having divided the armor over 3 decks on the class of ships. The battleships of this generation could not have been conceived, designed and built to withstand such an attack from the air, as at the time such a drastic and rapid development of the threat could not have been imagined. Roma was a victim of circumstances in several different ways. Like technology, with the German bombs and the circumstances she and her nation found themselves in September 1943, I'd love to hear what you all think about the loss of Roma and the circumstances that caused her destruction. In the future, I'm going to cover the demise of her sister ships, as they don't end in such a dramatic and explosive way. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, friends, have an amazing week.